On Contact with Chris Hedges. Welcome to On Contact. Today we're going to be speaking with the courageous Israeli journalist, Amira Hass.
Look, there are things that Netanyahu, of course, is different than others. I think he and the generation of today's rulers have no shame.
On Contact, neoliberalism is patriotism. Truth is not at the catch. Socialism, counterweight, class war, corporate coup d'etat, utopian ideology of neoliberalism, revolt unmasked. On Contact with Chris Hedges. Israel has been poisoned by the psychosis of permanent war. It has been morally bankrupted by the sanctification of victimhood, which it uses to justify an occupation that rivals the brutality and racism of apartheid South Africa. Its democracy, which was always exclusively for Jews, has been hijacked by extremists who are pushing the country toward a form of fascism. Many of Israel's most enlightened and educated citizens, 1 million of them, have left the country. Its most courageous human rights campaigners, intellectuals and journalists, Israeli and Palestinian, are subject to constant state surveillance, arbitrary arrests, and government-run smear campaigns. Its educational system, starting in primary school, has become an indoctrination machine for the military, and the growing intolerance, racism, and fanaticism, which always existed on the fringes of Israeli society, have moved into the political mainstream. Anya Parampil examines the public manifestations of racism that now characterize Israeli society.
In 1948, the United Nations partitioned historic Palestine into two states, an Arab state and a Jewish state known as Israel. Israel was founded by members of the Zionist movement who aimed to create an exclusively Jewish state in the majority Arab Palestine. And following its declaration of independence on May 15, 1948, an estimated 750,000 indigenous Palestinians were expelled from their homes by Zionist militias and made refugees. The day has become known as the Nakba, or the Day of Catastrophe to the Palestinian people. In the aftermath of the Nakba, Israel passed two critical laws, the Absentee Property Act and the Infiltration Prevention Act. As part of the Zionist effort to preserve Israel's ethnic purity, the laws forbade the presence of Palestinian refugees from Israel and gave the government power to seize homes in Jerusalem, kicking families out. The goal of Israel from now on would be to keep the most amount of Jews on the most amount of land and the most amount of Palestinians on the least amount of land possible. Thanks to several military offensives and illegal Jewish settlement expansion, over the decades, the borders once drawn for Israel have disappeared, along with Palestinian-controlled land. Palestinians continuously resist this expansion, most notably during the First and Second Intifadas, or uprisings, the second of which ended in 2005 and turned violent as the occupation deepened and the Israeli military's tactics hardened. Under the current right-wing Likud party, headed by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, the country has passed a slew of anti-democratic laws, including banning Nakba demonstrations, criminalizing the boycott of products from illegal settlements, and the creation of community acceptance laws, which actually allow neighborhoods to deny minorities residency. Israeli police are now also allowed to use sniper fire on child stone throwers. But considering the words of high-level Israeli politicians, perhaps these laws aren't so surprising. For example, during Israel's 51-day assault on the Gaza Strip in 2014, Education Minister Naftali Bennett responded to news of four Palestinian children blown up on the beach by the Israeli military by accusing them of, quote, self-genocide. Justice Minister Eilat Shaked has referred to all Palestinians as, quote, the enemy, and said in a Facebook post Palestinian mothers should be killed to prevent them from, quote, giving birth to little snakes. And Foreign Minister Avigdor Lieberman declared last year that Palestinians disloyal to Israel should have their heads cut off. Perhaps the current state of Israel is best summed up in the words of former President of the Supreme Court, Ahron Barak. Israel is different from other countries. It's not only a democratic state, but also a Jewish state.
There are few Israeli journalists who have the courage and integrity of Amira Hass. She is the only Israeli journalist who has lived for prolonged periods of time and continues to live in the occupied West Bank and the Gaza Strip. She is angered because of her uncompromising honesty, the Palestinian and Israeli leadership. The Israeli government has accused her of incitement to violence and had her arrested in 2009 after living in Gaza for several months for violating a law which forbids residence in an enemy state. Hass is the author of Drinking the Sea at Gaza, Days and Nights in a Land Under Siege. Please join me in conversation with one of the most intrepid and fearless reporters in Israel. Thank you, Amira.
Thank you, please.
Your awakening to the Palestinian condition, how did that happen?
Oh, that was quite early, I guess, because I was a red-diapered baby. So it's not...
Red-diaper baby?
My parents were in the Communist Party and Holocaust survivors, so it came very early. I think that it's... I mean, we won't start to go back that far.
But it's interesting because if you, like with Gideon Levy, another fine reporter, it really took his traveling within the occupied territories to change his understanding of what the occupation meant.
Yeah, I'm not that lucky, you know, like I was born understanding that, almost born understanding, because I lived I was part of a family that was, as I said, in the Communist Party, where there were Palestinian members, and we were at odds with the society around us. My father was arrested several times while I was a child, and my mother was arrested. The police came to arrest my mother because she distributed leaflets against Ben Gurion. So it was not
Ben Gurion being the founding,
first prime minister. So it's for me. I must say that I'm really not quite conservative in that sense.
Well, you were fortunate in your parents. Let's put it that way.
Yes, I guess. I mean, I don't deplore having been, you know, conservative in this way.
No, I was raised in the same household. Saved me a lot of time.
Yes. Yeah.
I just want to look at, you know, when I you know, lived for 7 years in the Middle East, two of those years in Israel. I was the Middle East bureau chief for the New York Times. You have that first generation, Ben Gurion being an example, but Abba Eban. Rabin came out of that. Teddy Kollek, the former mayor of Jerusalem. Many of these people born in Europe, not Rabin, but many of these people born in Europe, multilingual, highly educated. And the question was, how do you devolve to a Bibi Netanyahu or an Avigdor Lieberman? Or has the Zionist project always remained the same, hidden behind a different veneer?
Look, there are things that Netanyahu, of course, is different than others. I think he and the generation of today's rulers have no shame. In the times of Abba Eban, even Ben Gurion, they were hiding much.
Right.
They were not disclosing all what they were doing because still they were loyal to, or at least nominally, they were loyal to a set of values that they knew that they were violating in Israeli policies. So that's why they invented, if we make fast forward, that's why they invented with the occupation this notion of enlightened occupation. There is no enlightened occupation.
Well, they also carried out the brutal campaign of ethnic cleansing, the raising
in 48,
which is, you know, let's face it, far worse than anything even Bibi Netanyahu has done.
Sure. Only that, let's say, 48 still, I think, if you look historically...
This is the founding of the state of Israel.
It's 3 years after the end of the Second World War. It's, you know, Zionism is seen, was until then not so much adopted by the majority of Jews. And all of a sudden, it was adopted by more Jews only when Hitler actually succeeded in eliminating a great part of the Jewish people in Europe. So the circumstances, historical circumstances, were slightly different, or not slightly different. Europe had 12 million refugees. So it was not, we're not talking about Europe that was a benign place, a great place to live. It just emerged from one of the lowest periods of time in its history. So, and there was war. I mean, you can find ways to explain it or to describe it. While 67, actually Israel established in 67 that it is a colonial state.
But this is when it took control of
Gaza and the West Bank and East Jerusalem.
Right.
Yes, yeah, in the.
Well, you know that you take that great Israeli moral philosopher, yes, who saw what everything was, but he would mark the occupation of 67 as really the end, unless Israel relinquishes as the kind of end of Israel as a democratic or an open society. And he's been proven right.
Yes, then some would say, okay, also before Israel was democratic only because it got rid of the majority of Palestinians.
It was only democratic for Jews.
Yes, and then
always.
But you know, the thing is that if there is a chance to change, what are the chances? What are the opportunities we give ourselves to change?
Right.
And I think that the point where Israel showed that it does not change and that it is a colonial enterprise because it has so decided was with the Oslo Agreement. Because the Oslo in the 90s, the Oslo Agreement gave Israel a chance to cut loose from its colonialistic characteristics.
Right. Do you think that, because some people, Miko Peled and others, argue that Oslo was just another trick.
No, it was. That's exactly, but not on the part of the Palestinians.
No, on the part of...
So on the part of Israel. So when the whole world is expecting Israel, you know, now you have South Africa, it's over, and you have the end of the Cold War, it's with the collapse of the Soviet system. So there was an expectation of a change also here.
On the part of the outside world, but not on the part of the Israeli leadership.
So what Israel did is just use it in all the tricks possible to do just the opposite.
Right.
And we are talking, you know, people said, Palestinians, the great majority of Palestinians, they said, okay, we give you a chance. Actually, they accepted, they actually gave Israel a present. They gave Israeli society a present, acknowledging that there was something, okay, that 48 was ethnic cleansing, as you said, but it was also the historiography of a persecuted people that found refuge in this country. You know, I'm sure that without Hitler and without the Holocaust, Israel would not have existed, or Zionism would not have succeeded the way it did.
Right.
But this is, so Palestinians actually came and told the Israelis, we acknowledge your being here, you being a society here. And then what Israel did is just the opposite, just rejected this very generous offer.
We're going to get back to that after this break. Thanks.
What'd you have for breakfast yesterday? Why would you pick those shoes? How fast is your Wi-Fi? What's your dog's name? Why'd you name him that? Now I've interviewed you too. Question more.
People have got to know whether or not their president's a crook.
The American people deserve to know
what
answers.
What difference at this point does it make?
We must guard against the military-industrial complex.
The Cold War is over.
We shall never negotiate.
An American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima.
To know war is to know that there is still madness. Yet, we do what we must.
The only thing we have to fear is... I am officially running.
The future doesn't belong to the faint-hearted.
On Contact with Chris Hedges. Welcome back to On Contact. We're here with the Israeli journalist Amira Hass. So Amira, we spoke before the break a little bit about Oslo, 2,000-page document. But in brief, within that document, would you argue, because Israel retained control of the borders and essentially had a stranglehold on the economy, it was just a more sophisticated form of the occupation, or was there things in it that were more insidious than that?
Look, the main thing is that there is no mention of the goal of this so-called peace process.
Right.
So it doesn't state that the goal is 2 states.
Right.
So it is gradual. Okay, let's agree that you can withdraw gradually, but if you don't have a goal, what's gradual about it? Where to?
Right.
Then, of course, Israel maintained its control over the land, and it was supposed to be temporary until 99, and we are in 2016. And Israel has managed, from before Oslo, from 91 actually, to carve out the Palestinian territory, the would-be Palestinian state.
Well, they're taking more and more land.
Yes, and to create enclaves. So you have actually Palestinian reservations. Right. Gaza is the model, and then there is replicas in the West Bank,
kind of
which is in
which we should explain that what they've done, and I saw it on a UN map that a UN official gave me, is if you look at a map of the West Bank, you're correct that it's kind of pod-like areas when you count the settlements, the ring roads.
The area which Israel controls is 62% of the West Bank, and in between you have islands of Palestinian semi-sovereignty.
And let's touch on water here, because it's an issue that's often not discussed, but it's crucial. Israel, which you have pointed out, they cannot justify in the name of national security, has seized the aquifers.
Yeah, they use and they impose quota on the Palestinians. According to the agreement, about 80% of the aquifers in the West Bank, the water, is used by Israel, and 20% is for Palestinians, which is an outrage.
And you get
in Gaza,
in refugee camps, you get into houses where they don't have potable water coming out of the taps. They can't drink the water.
Not only there, you know, like refugee camps are sometimes are better off because they are being paid by others and they don't have to pay. No, you have in whole communities like in Hebron, all the summer they are in a special regime where they get water only once a week or once a month. Yes. In Gaza, which is even a worse crime, Gaza is taken as should be self-sufficient with the water it has on its aquifer. So in 1948, before the plight, and before it was filled with refugees, there were about 80,000 or 100,000 people, and the aquifer, they used from the water of the aquifer, which was about 170, if I'm correct, million cubic meter, and it's the same amount today when you have almost 2 million people. So they are supposed to be to use the same water as if they were an island separated from the rest of the country. So instead of having an agreement where Palestinians can, or when Israel, instead of the water that it steals in the West Bank, gives direct to Gaza, then no, they are over pumping, and 95% of the water in Gaza is undrinkable. They have to purify everything as if, you know, like in the worst places in the third world.
Let's talk about, because we're filming this in New York, you've been teaching at NYU, you're about to go back to Ramallah, which is in the West Bank, where you have been living and reporting. How, to outsiders, do you describe not only the occupation, but the evolution of the occupation in the years that you've been covering it?
The main thing is indeed this living in enclaves, that your psyche is getting used to living in enclaves, that there is semi or false or fake or quasi-sovereignty, sense of quasi-sovereignty within the enclaves under Palestinian policing power.
And what would you say? There's roughly about a half dozen in the West Bank. Would we call them on these kind of Bantustans?
Let me say it's about 7. I mean, you have Gaza. I mean, you have Jenin, you have Nablus, you have Tulkarem, you have Kalkilia, you have Ramallah, you have Hebron, you have Bethlehem.
And
so
we
it's about
we
6
should be
or
clear
7.
that one of the things the Israelis do is they make it very difficult to to travel between these enclaves.
It's different. I mean, with one of the successes of the World Bank and USAID or whatever was to guarantee that there is a contiguity, there is transportational contiguity. So you can, theoretically, you can go from Jenin and you can reach Ramallah and you don't go through too many Israeli checkpoints. But at any moment, Israel can close the roads. At any moment, you can run into an Israeli
And don't they
soldier.
inhibit the trafficking of produce between?
Yes, but it's not as it used to be 10 years ago. This is not the issue. I mean, the issue is that you need, in order to develop, you need the space, you need the land, you need, you said the water, but not just the water. You want to build, for example, land in Ramallah is ridiculously expensive because you cannot build in other places. So people are, so land inside Ramallah became more expensive than New York in some places. Dunam, I don't know how much people pay, maybe it's not more, but more than Tel Aviv. But you live in those enclaves and you feel that you are far, 1 kilometer from an Israeli base or 3 kilometers from a settlement. And you get used to it because still it is better than living directly under Israeli occupation.
Well, you have your quisling Palestinian Authority for...
Yes, I use milder word terms. I think it's not... I don't think that they did it from the beginning so consciously as he did. I mean, let's not exaggerate. But subcontractors, yes, you have subcontractors, but also not I mean, it's not just the subcontractors, but also there is a class in Palestinian society that right now they do not see any other horizon. Right. So they get used to this internal.
Is the Israeli tactic to reduce Palestinians to such a draconian subsistence level that all of their energy goes into just survival within these enclaves? Is that kind of the goal?
It might be true to say about Gaza, but about the West Bank, I think it would be it would be wrong to explain it that way. It's not such a low subsistence. I mean, it is. You have a middle class. You have opportunities to make money. You do have a growing Palestinian, in certain places, bourgeoisie. You do have it. It's not, I mean, people are not on the verge of poverty, on the verge of starvation or hunger.
As we see in Gaza.
And even in Gaza, okay, this is thanks to the world, yes. And even in Gaza, I mean, you have the whole world paying money, which is hush money, in order not to force Israel to.
Well, let's talk about what this is. What has this done to Israeli society? I mean, when I was in Israel, which was many years ago, you had figures like Meir Kahane, the right-wing Jewish extremist, spewing racist.
He's mainstream now.
Yes, that's exactly the point. He's mainstream now in figures like Avigdor Lieberman, even Netanyahu. What's happened? I mean, to what's happened to Israeli democracy? The Israeli state has been quite harsh with you.
With me?
Sure.
No.
Not compared to what they do to the Palestinians, but they've.
Yeah, it's you know, when you said I was arrested, I was detained for a few hours. It's not. Still, I say we have democracy for Jews. It is changing, of course, but not that dramatically. Like any society that has privileges, or any group that has privileges, and it's overstepping and you want to preserve your privileges, and those who are underprivileged fight against these privileges, then you have to justify all your ways of controlling and repression by theories of racist theories. I think this is true about many places in the world, if not all, where you have privileges. So men have privileges, so they will develop ideas about inferiority of women in order to safeguard. And so it is, and the more we have privileges, and the more it is clear that it is at the account of the Palestinians, and the more it is at the account of any prospect for change and fairness, if not justice, in the country, the more Israeli society have to explain it by racist terms and that these are Arabs and they do not deserve it and they don't need it and they are better off with us.
Doesn't this have, I think arguably it does have ramifications internally within Israel? You're seeing, and we'll close with this increasing suppression of Israeli human rights groups, journalists such as yourself, that disease has now come back to eat.
This is normal. I mean, in a way, maybe surprisingly late. But yes, they address. Look, they address the Israeli human rights organization and anti-occupation organizations, those that focus on the settlements. And the settlements embody this notion of Israeli privileges. Right. Of course, in the very fact that you can move there and get land for...
And that is the policy, constant building. I mean, the last time I was in East Jerusalem, the first time I was in East Jerusalem was 1988. It doesn't even look like the same city anymore.
Sure, and the West Bank. So like a group such as Ta'ayush is a target of both the government and settlement organizations. Groups such as Breaking the Silence, right, which is focusing on the occupation and the settlements. So they are being targeted. Yes, and the Israelis go with it. Right. The general Israeli public, because they are afraid. The Israeli society, Israel used to be a welfare state. Since the 70s, there was an attack on Israeli welfare state. And with the erosion of the withering away of the Israeli welfare state, there is a substitute, and this is in the occupied territory, right. The settlements.
There. Thank you, Amira. The Israeli religious scholar and moral philosopher Yeshayahu Leibowitz once wrote that religious nationalism is to religion what National Socialism was to socialism. Leibowitz, who died in 1994, understood that the blind veneration of the military, especially after the 1967 war, where Israel captured the West Bank and East Jerusalem, was dangerous and would lead to the ultimate destruction of Israeli democracy. He foresaw, as he said, that the Arabs would be the working people, and the Jews, the administrators, inspectors, officials, and police, mainly secret police. He feared that a virulent racism would consume Israeli society. He knew that prolonged occupation of the Palestinians would spawn concentration camps for the occupied, and that, in his words, Israel would not deserve to exist, and it will not be worthwhile to preserve it. Thank you for watching. You can find us on rt.com/oncontact. Until next week.